Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. And we are about to begin the 2043 offseason. Was an interesting year in Buffalo. For just the second time in the last 12 years, we did not win the National League East. But we did make the playoffs for a 16th consecutive season. And despite having to start in the wild card round, we did make it all the way to the league championship series. Unfortunately, that is where we lost to the one team in baseball that had more victories than we did this year, the 105-win Washington Nationals, who beat us by 8 games in the National League East. They took us out 4-2 in the World Series before they proceeded to be upset by the Tigers in the World Series. So in terms of winning a 4th World Series title, we definitely fell short in terms of that goal as we sit here 16 major league seasons and 18 major league seasons with 16 consecutive playoff appearances and 21 seasons overall, including those first 3 seasons when we were only running the minor leagues in Buffalo that we were building out. The good news is that we've gone at this point to 9 league championship series. The bad news is that we have a 3-6 record in those National League Championship series. So we've done a pretty good job in terms of obviously making the playoffs every season and having a good amount of long runs where we won at least one playoff series to get to the LCS. But that 3-6 record in the championship series is certainly disappointing. The only positive thing is that when we have made it to the World Series, we are 3-0 in the World Series with our 2034, 2036, and 2041 World Series championships. Goal is hopefully to get at least one more before this playthrough winds down. We're certainly in the later innings of the playthrough. At this point, I intend to see through the end of Deshaun Seifu's career and then see through the next 5 seasons before we'll be able to see whether or not he's elected as a first ballot Hall of Famer. And I figure about the time we get through the next 6 or 7 seasons and those things have likely occurred, it'll probably be OOTP 25 time. So the timing should work out pretty well. But still have many seasons to play between now and then. And this is probably going to be the most potentially franchise-altering offseason we have had in a long time. Because as we touched upon in the end of the last episode, we have a lot of decisions to make. Potential free agents, potential arbitration-eligible players who may be starting to make more than we can really afford to pay them. And we'll go through in this episode our review of the 2043 season in depth, as we always do at the end of the season, and start planning for the off season and talking about some of those decisions that we're going to need to make. You can see as we sit here on November 3rd, looks like we've got decent money to play with $26 million available. But that's really driven by the fact that we've just pared our scouting and player development budgets down pretty significantly, and hopefully we'll be able to increase those back to more appropriate levels when the major off-season action is done. But right now we want to give ourselves the financial flexibility if we decide that any of our pending free agents are players that we would like to attempt to bring back. As we think about where the team stands here, excellent pitching as usual, first in the National League in runs allowed, and you can see we were first or second in almost every major pitching category. The only exceptions were BABIP, where we were 6th, and strikeouts, where we were 5th. A very good defensive team, 5th in defensive efficiency and 2nd in zone rating. and a competent but not great offense. Sixth in the National League in runs scored, so in the top half of the league. And you can see we were in the top half of the league in most batting categories, a couple of exceptions being extra base hits where we were ninth, homers where we 11th, and strikeouts where we were 12th. All added up to that 97-65 record that I mentioned earlier, which was 5 games below Pythagorean expectation. So when all was said and done, we had another good, solid season this year. Would have certainly preferred to win it all, but you can't always get what you want. But sometimes you can get what you need. And what we need is really what we're going to need to figure out through the course of this episode and our next episode before the off-season really begins in earnest. You can see we've got a lot of arbitration-eligible players this year. We've made offers to several of them. Barbarito, Lance, Auclair, and Cheek, all important right-handed pitchers, made one-year offers to them. And we made a multi-year offer to the shortstop Jim Andrews, 6 years, $36 million total. He's a respectable offensive player who's a good defensive shortstop. I think with the type of money we had to offer him, if he ends up sliding into more of a utility role, it's still someone who we can afford. And I think it's a tradable contract going forward. So hopefully that'll work out. But as we think about the rest of the team, we've got some more interesting decisions to make. Mike Whitehead and Alejandro Contreras have both been utility infielders for us the last couple of years. Whitehead is now arbitration eligible. Contreras, because he's spent a lot of time in AAA, is not. But with the emergence of the young infielder Danny Ferguson, who we picked in the first round a year ago and made his major league debut this September, probably don't have room for both Whitehead and Contreras on the roster next year. And Contreras is cheaper. I think Whitehead is a little better. The question is, for a sixth infielder, do you go with a player who's a little cheaper and maybe try to trade away Whitehead, or do the reverse? Robbie Farrell is a right-handed reliever who's been solid for us. Just don't know that want to be guaranteeing him over $1 million since he's kind of a borderline roster player for us at this point. And then the interesting decision among our pitchers really has to do with David Espinoza, a guy who's come up through our system after being a third-round pick over a decade ago. He's primarily been a reliever for us over the years, although he does have the stamina and the arsenal to start. The issue with him is he's set to make a little over $7 million next year in what will be his final arbitration-eligible season. And he's been a really good pitcher for us, you can see, with a 1.53 ERA plus and a 79 FIP minus over the course of his career. The question is whether he's really worth about $7 million if we're only going to use him as a reliever. The complicating factor in all of this is that you may remember that over the past year we were a little short on left-handed pitchers for our pitching staff. Only 3 of our 13 pitchers were left-handed, including Espinoza. And the other 2 left-handed pitchers are Nate Ruckel and Sean Drawn, who we have team options on both of them this season. Ruckel coming off of a serious injury that's going to keep him, or Drawn coming off of a serious injury that's going to keep him out a good chunk of next season. And Ruckel set to make $9 million next year if we exercise his option. So we conceivably could be in a situation where we have no left-handed pitchers signed if we decide to move on from all 3 of them, which, given that I typically like to have at a minimum 3 and preferably 4 or maybe even 5 lefties on the pitching staff, is, as I often say, not optimal. Similarly, when we think about our offense, with our 13 position players this past year, we only had 3 left-handed hitters and a switch hitter. The switch hitter, our center fielder, Ishmael Velasco, will be back. The left-handed hitter who got the fewest at-bats, the young outfielder Canales, will probably be back in a utility outfielder role. But the issue is that the best left-handed bat we have, Luis Comadran, is headed to free agency. And we have a team option on the other left-handed bat, the veteran catcher Mitch Houlihan, who's set to make $9 million next year, which is pretty expensive for a backup catcher. So similarly to the situation we are in with our left-handed pitchers, it's very conceivable if we move on from the team option on Houlihan and don't make an offer to Mr. Comadran that we have one left-handed hitter and one switch hitter on our team. Clearly, we can remedy and rectify that during free agency and through trades in the offseason and maybe even the Rule 5 draft. But once again, such a right-handed, heavy lineup is probably not optimal. The veteran outfielders Bobby Bolig and Dylan Bond, also free agents, and then Juan Romero, who has led our team in runs batted in each of the 5 years that he's been with us, also a potential free agent. And after he accepted our qualifying offer last year, he is going to be a true free agent. So a lot of big decisions that we need to think about as this offseason gets underway. So with that framework of how I'm thinking about things on the table, let's take a look at how everyone actually performed last season. So taking a look at our pitching staff, Alexis Barajas will be back as our ace next year, 13-8 with a 3.76 ERA this year. So a bit of a regression for him. His 4 WAR was his lowest since his 30-year-old season in 2039. Still has had a real nice career with us. Could be nearing the end of his run, though. He's 35 years old now, set to make $20 million next year, and then he's got a player option in the final year of his contract after that. Very happy to have him back as our number 1 starter again next year. And although there could be a fair amount of turnover in this team as far as our pitching, we've already alluded to some of the left-handers, and there's some other bullpen arms that we could be missing. The positive thing is that we'll probably have the same 5 guys back in our starting rotation, so a lot of stability there, and you can see the 5 starters there started practically every game for us this past year. Jim Lance is finally headed to his arbitration years, set to make around $7 million this year. We'll happily pay him that, 13-7 with a 2.97 ERA and a league best 1.07 whip while putting up a 5 WAR. The second-round pick in 2036 has been one of the best developing players of our farm system over the course of this playthrough. Eric Barbarito headed into, I believe, his final arbitration eligible year. The number going to be higher, a little over $10 million, and he's not as good a pitcher as Lance. He actually had a losing record for us this year, 12-14, with a 4.19 ERA. But his Sierra was 3.11. His whip of 1.22 was still respectable. I don't know that we make a long-term commitment to him. I do like that he's an Iron Man. Do like that he's got some positive personality traits and throws in the high 90s. But I think he's more of a 3rd or 4th starter. And he's looking for relatively big money, which is why we just made him the offer to bring him back 1 year. The last two guys are guys who are on major league minimum contracts, so we'll be happy to have Chris Lott back as a number 4 starter, 13-9 with a 3.10 ERA, his first full season in the majors. Probably will get some Rookie of the Year votes. And we can say the same thing about Simeon Manelli, 14-3 with a 2.84 ERA. And he's actually not on a minimum contract anymore. We did the same playbook with Manelli that we did with Luis Palencia a year ago. I don't know if it's a hack or just a coincidence, but it seems like these pitchers who have 4+ or 3+ pitch arsenals that have enough pitches to be an effective starter but have relatively low stamina are not particularly highly valued by the game. So we signed Manelli to a 10-year, $31 million deal this year. Buys out all of his minimum years and his arbitration years, as well as a couple of free agent years and then some team options at the end. But feel if we end up spending $3.5 million on him, if he's able to give us 160-ish innings with a sub-3 ERA like he did this year as a starter, that's an incredible bargain for us. Even if we need to move him into the bullpen or he ends up being more effective in the bullpen, paying him $3.5 million a year is not a bad contract for us. Like the positive personality traits, like the durability. So happy to have Manelli back on board next year. So the good news is that the excellent starting rotation will largely be back. The bad news is that we could have a fair amount of turnover in the bullpen, led by Joe Scott, who's been our closer since we picked him up in a trade with the San Diego Padres 6 years ago. He's now headed to free agency. You can see a 4-time All-Star, 2-time Mariano Award winner for us. Had a pretty good year this year, 97 strikeouts in 72 1/3 innings pitched, 2.49 ERA. Over the course of his career, he's put up a brilliant 184 ERA plus, 70 FIP minus, averaged around 40 saves a year for us over the 6 years that he has been our closer. Actually, he averaged 42 saves a year for us, if I can do some simple math, over the 6 years he's been our closer. But he is a guy who is looking for fair or full value on the market, $13 million a year for 4 years. Not egregious for a closer, but it may be a little rich for us, especially given that he's fragile as far as his injury proneness. Don't know that Scott is gone for sure, but $13 million a year for a closer is definitely pushing what we can afford. Floyd Auclair, who we moved from a starter last year to our stopper role this year, he's got a similar profile to Palencia and Manelli, but for whatever reason, despite that 35 stamina, is not nearly as willing to sign a bargain basement contract. So he is headed to a year where he's going to be making around $8 million. We've already made an offer to him in arbitration. Didn't want to hit the bid on him at a much higher number for a longer term contract. Coming off a year where he led the league with 91 games and 37 holds, pitched 139 1/3 innings as a reliever, and he led our team with 194 strikeouts as a reliever, which, given that we've got some pretty good starting pitching, is pretty incredible. So the 3.68 ERA for the year was not devastatingly impressive, but his SIERA of 2.47 was pretty solid. Happy to have him back in the mix. He could be a stopper next year. He could end up moving into the rotation. If we move on from Joe Scott, it's also not inconceivable that Auclair could end up as our closer. So he will likely be back and in an important role for us. Exactly what that role is, though, is to be determined here on November 3rd. Moving on to the rest of the relievers, Nate Ruckel was our longtime stopper. We re-signed him as a free agent this past year, but moved him out of the stopper role to put Auclair in there. 7-6 with a 3.11 ERA over 55 innings, so we used him a lot less this year. Team option for $9 million next year on Ruckel, which will be tricky for us to afford given the financial situation that we're in, but given that we are, as I noted earlier, in a situation where we may not have any left fielder or left-handed pitchers coming back, we're definitely receptive to making a deal with him. And when I took a look at Mr. Ruckel and what he's thinking about a contract, he's saying $2.4 million a year over 3 years. So as we saw with Deshaun Seifu last year, the right move may be to decline the option on Ruckel and then see if he's still willing to sign a deal with us at a much more reasonable level. It's also possible we anger him and that's the end of our relationship with him, but I'd rather give him $1 million buyout right now and then sign him back for $2.5–3 million a year, perhaps with some other team options, than guarantee him $9 million for next year at this point. So we are going to void that last contract year, and that technically kicks Ruckel into the list of potential free agents on our team. Let's see if he's still willing to engage. And he is willing to do that 3-year contract and an average of $2.4 million. He wants a player option at the end. We are going to be pretty aggressive with him. Try to get a deal that is really good for us. $2 million a year for 3 years with team options in those second and third seasons. If we can get him locked up for anything similar to this amount, we'll at least have one left-hander that we like, that we know will be back in our bullpen next year. And Ruckel is willing to consider that option. So had to do the $1 million payout, but to have him for potentially 3 more years at $2 million a year with a lot of team optionality rather than $9 million for next season, you can see has opened up potentially more money for us to play with going forward, and hopefully means that we will have at least one left-handed arm in our bullpen as free agency begins. David Rivera, a right-handed reliever. We've already exercised his option for next year at $1.4 million. 2.73 ERA with 84 strikeouts over 66 innings. He's been a good, solid reliever for us the 2 years since he's joined us. Happy to have him back for a third and possibly final season with us next year. Another right-hander, the arbitration-eligible Pat Cheek. We've made an offer to bring him back as well. 3 ERA over 63 innings pitched. Another good, solid right-handed reliever. Could start in a pinch with his 3-pinch arsenal. David Espinoza, we talked about him at the outset of the episode. The concern is just whether we want to be spending close to $7 million a year on him next year. With the fact that we're going to be bringing Ruckel back, probably puts a little less pressure on us to bring him back. But Espinoza has been a good, solid pitcher for us ever since he came up. He's always had an ERA plus well above the league average, or well better than the league average. And he's always had a FIP minus better than league average. And with the exception of a year ago, he's always been pretty significantly better than the league average. So he's been a very valuable left-handed arm out of the bullpen for us. Just don't know if he's a $7 million arm. He is durable, and he certainly does have the stamina to be a starter, although we've given him the opportunity to start just 7 games over the course of his career, given that our rotation has typically been so deep. If you've got thoughts on what we should do with Espinoza, would love to hear those. Robbie Farrell, another guy headed to arbitration, struggled this year with a 5.50 ERA over 36 innings. He's kind of been one of the final arms out of our bullpen over the last few years. So he'd be, a guy who's going to be the 12th or 13th guy in our pitching staff if we bring him back. The 1.2 million arbitration number is certainly not frightening, but the question is whether we'd be better off trading him away, seeing what we can get from him, and bringing up a guy from the minors making the major league minimum. Chris Powers, another right-handed reliever, spent most of this year in AAA Albany, but he is one of the guys who could very conceivably take over for Farrell. He's still got 2 option years left, and he's still set to make the major league minimum. Looking at his profile and the fact that he has, over the brief opportunities he's been given at the major league level, been a pretty effective pitcher for us. Powers is kind of one of the guys that I think we probably bring back if we move on from Farrell. Mike Roberts, another guy who potentially lets us replace Farrell, the 7th-round pick out of Coastal Carolina, has been primarily in Albany for several years now. Had a couple short stints in the major leagues at this point. Was really good a year ago, was really bad this year. But let's be honest, it's only 15 1/3 combined innings, so I don't know how much we can read into it one way or another. But when you do look at the stats overall, he's been reasonably effective. So I think my thought is here, probably don't pay Farrell $1.2 million. It's not a huge number, but with guys like Powers and Roberts, who were primarily in AAA this year, if we're just looking for another generic right-handed arm, go with the guys making the major league minimum and see if Farrell's got any trade value for us. And Luis Palencia, another guy who was not really on the major league team this year, spent the first half of the year recovering from an injury that ended his 2042 season early. He was not good in Albany. We did bring him up in September with all the depth we had. He ended up just pitching 1 game for us, which was unfortunate. But although he's fragile physically, we've scouted him at this point post his injury. Still kind of looks like he is what he's always been. He, similar to Simeon Manelli, is a guy that we signed to a long-term contract. Probably more likely to be a reliever for us than a starter, but could start for us in a pinch. Just don't know with the fact that we like the 5 guys who we had in the rotation last year, whether he'll even get that opportunity. But Palencia certainly will be in the mix to be in our bullpen next season. So the big decisions are really the closer, Joe Scott, looking for $13 million a year, and the left-handed reliever, Espinoza, looking for around $7 million in arbitration. And then we've also got a decision on Sean Drawn, the 34-year-old left-hander, suffered a torn rotator cuff right near the end of the regular season. Going to be out for the first couple months of next year. He'll probably be 35 years old by the time he's pitching in the majors again. He is a guy who has been a good, solid left-handed reliever for us the past 3 seasons, and his the team option on him at $1.2 million is not anything that excessive. I guess my thought is just he's going to be missing the first month or 2 of next season. Who knows what he's going to look like on the other side of this injury. do we decline the option, let him hit free agency? If someone wants to give him a big contract, good for drawn. If somebody doesn't, we could probably bring him back, potentially even on a minor league deal, given that he's going to be out for the first couple months of the season. So kind of a similar situation with drawn to what I've talked through with the option or the arbitration number on Farrell versus the option on drawn. Not huge numbers in either case, at about 1.2 million for both of them, but it might make sense to trade Farrell away and decline the option on drawn, just to open up a little bit more money in our budget and give us a little more optionality as we approach the off season. So a lot of interesting decisions to make with the pitching staff this year, and we've got a lot of interesting decisions with the position players as well. Mentioned Mitch Houlihan, one of the two important left-handed hitters who we've got a decision on. Team option at $8 million for him for this upcoming season. He is a guy who claims he's looking for $9 million a year, so don't think we'll be able to get him back at a bargain basement level if we do opt out of our team option. He's been our primary starter for several years at this point at catcher, but he's fragile physically, generally misses time every year. He is a career 300 hitter over almost 1,800 career at-bats at this point, but he's fragile, as we mentioned. He's going to be turning 31 shortly, and the only 2 years in his career where he's batted below 299 are the last two seasons, when he's hit 280 and then 260 this past year. And those are also the only two seasons where he's been a below-average offensive player as far as his WRC+. So, though I enjoyed having him basically in a platoon with Ramirez this year, and I like his good defensive skills, $8 million for a guy who we envision to be probably our backup catcher next year seems a bit much. The fact that we are so hobbled in terms of not having a lot of left-handed batters, though, does make potentially bringing him back a little more interesting to me. If we moved on from Houlihan, Jarrett Obenchain would likely be the backup. Solid defensively. The issue with Mr. Obenchain is that he's out of options. So if we bring him back, we're going to need to guarantee him a major league contract, most likely, which I don't know that I want to do. The one catcher we know we're going to have back is Juan Ramirez, the excellent defensive catcher who we signed as a free agent, an international free agent, but not an international amateur free agent. Almost 2 years ago at this point, spent most of last year in the minors with us before a cup of coffee, and then ended up splitting time pretty evenly with Houlihan this year. 241, 16 doubles, 7 homers, and 282 at-bats, a 90 WRC+. Still think he could draw more walks than he did this year with that durability and that good glove. Very happy to have him back at expected cost of $4.5 million next year. We know Ramirez will be back, and Daniel Rojas will be back too. He's heading into the final year of that 4-year, $120 million deal he signed with us. Has had 3 straight solid years for us with 134, 125, and 129 WRC pluses. 22 homers and 78 ribbies this year, so it was, in terms of those numbers, the least productive year that he had with us. Still put up an 823 OPS, and with the fact that 2 of the other big hitters in the middle of our lineup are headed to free agency in Misters Romero and Coma Duran. Would tend to think that Rojas will be back with us. Certainly could, similar to last offseason, consider a trade for him to maybe get that contract off the books the last season at $30 million and maybe give us a little more financial flexibility. I think that's something we'll think about more in the coming weeks as we see who potentially will be on the free agent market. Right now, tend to think Rojas will be back with us next year to play out the final year of his contract. Mentioned Alejandro Contreras. The big thing he has going for him is that with just 2 years and 48 days of service, despite the fact that at this point he has spent parts of the last 5 seasons in the major league, he's making the major league a minimum again next year. Looks competent-ish offensively, competent defensively, can play multiple positions, but given his low work ethic, he's not necessarily all that great at learning new positions. I do note that his low adaptability seems to have dropped off, so that could be a byproduct of the fact that we generally have a lot of players with really good personalities and good coaches around. So maybe being around a lot of guys who are more adaptable than him has rubbed off positively on him, and maybe getting the last bit of learning that he needs at third base and first base will be a little easier right now. Only hit .204 in 98 major league at-bats this year. Over the course of his major league career, he's put up a 93 WRC plus. So a useful infielder, not a superstar. As I mentioned, he's going to be likely competing for a roster spot next year, kind of a similar position to where he's been for the last few years. Part of the reason Contreras will need to compete is that I think Danny Ferguson, the first-round pick from a year ago, has a roster spot assured. Combined for 39 homers across 3 levels this year, including 3 at the majors. Only an 80 WRC plus as he kind of slowed down a bit after a really fast start. But looking at his potential batting profile, his potential defensive profile, his high work ethic, and the fact he's only going to be 23 years old and making the major league minimum next year, hard to foresee a scenario where Ferguson won't be an important infielder for us. We traded for the young third baseman Ramiro Medina last offseason. Another guy, we like his batting profile. We like his defensive profile. He can run a little. He can bunt a little. And he had a solid year for us, a 93 WRC plus, a WAR of almost 3. Batting average of .235 we'd hope could be a little bit higher, but did have 21 homers and 76 ribbies for us, while also stealing 23 bases in 25 attempts. So he looks like he could be the at least medium-term answer for us at third base, set to make the major league minimum again next year, and then he'll get into his arbitration seasons, at which point maybe eventually he prices himself out, but probably going to be a member of our team the next few years. Jim Andrews, the shortstop, was injured for the playoffs, unfortunately. We could have used his glove, a competent bat, put up a 94 WRC plus for us this year, 15 homers, 58 ribbies. As I mentioned earlier, we've got a 6-year, I believe, $36 million offer to him for a potential extension, and you can see the offers we've made to the arbitration-eligible players, as well as the offer we talked about earlier with Ruckel that are outstanding. So Andrews should be back with us next year. Whitehead at this point, coming off of a real nice year, 287 average, 94 WRC plus. Another guy who's competent-ish offensively, pretty versatile defensively as an infielder. You look at the batting stats over the course of his career, an 89 WRC plus. He's a little worse than Contreras in terms of that metric. As I mentioned, Contreras is a 93. and Contreras is set to make the major league minimum this upcoming year, whereas Whitehead set to make about $2.5 million in his first arbitration eligible year. So in theory, the two of those guys are competing for kind of the final utility infield spot on our team, because Deshaun Seifu is going to be back. We've got the team option for him for $6 million. Taking a look, it looks like he'd consider signing for a little bit less, $4.3 million a year. But coming off of a year where he hit over 300, still stole 48 bases despite turning 39 years old. His 109 WRC plus was the best he's had in the past several years. He is a captain personality, still very fleet on the base paths, an Iron Man who can play every day. Defensively, he doesn't bring much. He's really a DH/first baseman at this point, although at one time he was a Gold Glove winning second baseman 15 years ago. But his speed in the field has failed him, even though he's pretty speedy on the base paths at this point. He, of course, for those of you who have been watching, got the 3,000th hit of his career this past season. I could, it seems like, try to get him down to about $4 million, but given the fact that he signed that team-friendly deal for us last offseason, we're going to show Mr. Seifu some respect and not fool around with him and just go ahead and execute the option to bring him back with us for yet another season next year. Right now, he's penciled in as our DH against both left-handed and right-handed pitching and our leadoff hitter. I could conceivably see him moving into more of a utility role against right-handed pitching while ultimately being our leadoff hitter against left-handed pitching over the course of next year if all of a sudden he's struggling to hit 250. That's never been an issue for him, but he's also going to be turning 40 next year. Every year with him could kind of be the final season he has with us, but glad to confirm here on November 3rd that Seifu will be back with us again next year. And last but not least, we will turn to our outfielders. Bobby Bolig came up in September. He's been a guy who we signed to a minor league contract each of the past 2 seasons. Last year, he was on the playoff roster. This year, he only got 9 at-bats in September and did not make the playoff roster. He's headed back to free agency, and for a third straight year, he's looking for way more than I think he's worth on the open market. So we'll be letting Mr. Bolig hit free agency again. Dylan Bond is a guy we traded for right before the trade deadline. He did a nice job for us. 290 average, 6 homers and 19 ribbies and 93 at-bats. Another veteran looking for $25 million a year over 3 years. So he will certainly not be with us back next year unless those demands come down considerably over the next few months. Josh Porter is a guy we picked up in a trade with Atlanta 3.5 years ago at this point. Been with us for the last, he's been with us for the last 4 seasons. So it was 3.5 years ago that we picked him up, but there's been 4 seasons played in that time period. He's a guy who's sometimes been a full-time starter for us. 2 years, he's basically been an everyday player. 2 years, he's been more of a platoon player. The 2 years that he's been a platoon player, he's put up 138 WRC pluses for us both years. The years that he's been more of a full-time player, he's put up a 119 and a 95 WRC plus. He is headed to his final arbitration season. The number is close to $8 million. Looking at his speed and his durability and his batting profile and his good outfield range, and the fact he is coming off a year where he had 23 doubles and 14 homers in just 253 at-bats, given that we're potentially losing two big outfield bats in Ramiro and Coma Duran, we've made an offer to Porter already to bring him back and think it's very conceivable he'll have a more important role for us next year, given that the money he is looking for is much less significant than what either Ramiro or Coma Duran are looking for at this point. And the final four outfielders who are on our roster this past season feature two players who will be back with us next year, almost certainly, and then two players that we've got big decisions to make on. We'll start with the two players who will be back. Center fielder Ishmael Velasco, former Rookie of the Year and World Series MVP in 2041 when he was also an All-Star. Had for him an off year this year at the age of 26. Only a 102 WRC plus when all was said and done. 275 average with 17 homers and 64 ribbies. Still stole 19 bases, but the number of extra base hits was down pretty significantly with 12 fewer doubles and 3 fewer triples than a year ago. Only put up a 2.1 WAR. Hopefully we'll get a bit of a bounce back year from him next year. He's still very economical, even though he is signed to a longer term contract. Durable, good defensively, good in the clubhouse, and a solid bat. He should be back as our center fielder next year, and hopefully we'll get a bit more offense out of him. And then we touched on Edgar Canales a bit earlier, the left-handed hitting utility outfielder. Hit 261 with 5 homers in 138 at-bats. With the potential departures of several outfielders, as we've talked about, he could be in line for more playing time next year, given that he's making the major league minimum. He's got a pretty solid left-handed bat, pretty good outfield range, pretty good personality in the clubhouse. He will certainly be back with us next year. The only question is, will he be a fifth outfielder? Will he be a fourth outfielder? Will he be a platoon outfielder playing against right-handed pitching? Or will he ultimately be someone who's in the lineup every day? And with Bolig and Bond almost certainly gone, what happens with Juan Ramiro and Luis Coma Duran will go a long way towards determining what Canales' role is with us next year. Juan Ramiro has been with us for 5 years now, and as I touched upon earlier, all he has done in those 5 years is lead the Buffalo Wings in runs batted in every season. That said, the 106 WRC plus that he put up this year was the lowest in his career and the lowest in his Buffalo tenure. His 21 homers and 90 ribbies were also the lowest numbers that he's put up over the course of his career. He is looking for 6 years at about $19 million a year. So it is a contract that we could afford. He's been a good offensive player for us. He's an Iron Man. He, along with Seifu, are the two captain personalities that we have. So in a perfect world, would love to bring him back. I think some of it depends on whether there's any trade market for Rojas. And then some of it also depends on whether we would prefer to bring back Luis Coma Duran. Coma Duran, 31 years old, similar age, durable, not as good in the clubhouse, but the positive things for Coma Duran are, the most positive thing is that he's a left-handed hitter, and he has been the best left-handed hitter on our team basically since we picked him up. 135, 140, and 128 WRC pluses for these past 3 seasons, and he has been an all-star each of those 3 seasons. 282 average, 21 homers, and 86 ribbies this year. An incredibly consistent offensive player in his 3.5 years from Buffalo. His batting average is 274, 276, 282, and 283. And you can see for the 3 full years, 21 to 26 homers and 80 to 86 ribbies. So a very consistent player. He's better against right-handed pitching than he is against left-handed pitching. I mean, quite honestly, with those pretty dramatic splits, he's basically a platoon player who fortunately bats left-handed, so he'll be playing 120, 130 starts a year, most likely, even if he's only starting against right-handed pitching. The issue is he's looking for 5 years at $20 million a year. We had him signed for next year, but unfortunately we had to give him a player option for $17 million for this upcoming season, which he has just opted out of. So would love to have him back, especially with the dearth of left-handed hitting that we have. Right now, the only left-handed hitter that we're confident we're going to have back next year is Canales, and the only switch hitter we're confident we're going to have back is Velasco. So we certainly need another left-handed hitter. The question is whether should it be Houlihan, Bolig, Comadran, some combination of those three, or somebody else. Pretty confident it won't be Bolig. The question is whether it should be Comadran and or Houlihan. And to kind of start framing in what we may want to do with the likes of Comadran and Romero as they potentially head towards free agency, and Rojas as he heads into his potential final year with us, is take a quick look at what the upcoming free agent class looks like. And you can see among the offensive players, there's a few familiar names. Bond, who we had for part of this season, looking for big money as we talked about. Max Clark, who we had a few years ago as a rental, tried to trade for him this past offseason. Actually, I can't say we tried to trade for him. We considered trading for him, and the price was so high that it just wasn't something that was going to work for us. He's 38 years old, he's wrecked physically, and he's looking for over $25 million a year, so I don't think that works, although the left-handed bat is certainly attractive. Yuji Harita, a first baseman, very good power and incredible eye, but he's unmotivated and he's looking for over $30 million a year. That probably won't work. Roman Maples is a guy who we followed since he was a kid in the draft. We thought about taking him at number 2 overall. He ended up going 8th overall. He's wrecked physically at this point, but still looks like a good, solid defensive shortstop with a bat that could be useful. Question is whether you're going to get 140 games from him or 40 games from him at $18 million. That may be a bit expensive for us to gamble on. Taking a look at the few of the left-handed hitters who could be out there, assuming that Clark is not an option. First baseman Juan Ayala looks like an interesting bat. Solid against right-handed pitching. Hit 271 with 17 homers for the Cubs, but he's had a below-average WRC plus 3 straight years. Going to turn 33 next season. Not the best in the clubhouse. No speed. Brings nothing to the table defensively. He's certainly a lot cheaper as a first baseman than Mr. Rojas. But I don't know that I want to bring an unmotivated guy on the team. Bolig, we've talked about, looking for too much money at this point. Mauricio Bonilla, a 30-year-old first baseman, another guy, no glove, no speed. He's a lefty hitter with some pop, but last 3 years he's been overall a below-average offensive player and actually a below replacement level player overall over the last 3 years. So I can't see spending $8 million a year on him. Mike Clyburn, 30-year-old center fielder. Like him defensively. The bat is not particularly interesting to me. Looks like about a league average offensive player. We need a lefty hitter, but I don't think at $12 million, Clyburn is a difference maker. We've talked about Coma Duran, Danny Havens, first baseman. Nothing special with that bat and doesn't bring much of anything to the table defensively. Mike Markell is a guy we looked at last offseason, looking for over $20 million a year. With his defensive limitations, I think I would prefer Mr. Coma Duran over Markell as well. Spencer Nivens, 41 years old, Kadir Notice, and TJ Pressey are other left-handed hitters, but not incredible amounts of power and still looking for $12, $13, $14 million a year. We'll take a look just at the last of the three-star players here. Those of you who want to dig deeper certainly can, and you can see Jorge Aragui, a decent left-handed hitter, Iron Man, looking for $16 million. Sean Stewart, left fielder, not the greatest bat in the world, positive in the clubhouse, fragile physically, looking for $11 million a year. Clearly, no guarantees that any of these players are going to make it to free agency. But when I think about the left-handed hitters who are out there, I kind of like the guy on our team, Coma Duran. As we've talked about, he's been with us for 3.5 years now. Over the course of his career with Buffalo, he's put up a 131 WRC plus. He's durable. He's really a good hitter against right-handed pitching. He's competent defensively. He's not the greatest guy in the clubhouse, maybe a bit of a clubhouse lawyer with his outspoken nature, but we've won a World Series with him. He's been a 3-time All-Star with us, and as I said, he's been a pretty productive offensive player with us. He opted out of a $17 million a year contract that we would have been very happy to have him with. You can see he's looking for 5 years at $20 million a year, player option at the end, a no trade clause. I think we try to get him for a little less money and a little less years, but I'm inclined to get an offer out to him because right now we don't have anyone. We have only one left-handed pitcher or one left-handed hitter who's going to be on the team in Canales, and there's no guarantee that Canales is going to be in the lineup every day. Coma Duran, if we bring him on board, we know that he's going to be right in the middle of the lineup every day against right-handed pitching. I don't see a better bat than him potentially on the free agent market. Now we can certainly explore a trade, and that may be something to consider in the offseason. Before I get the offer out to him, for those of you who are wondering, we'll shop Rojas here just to see what, if any, options there are for his final year at $30 million a year. We can take back a huge contract for 4 years with Yoichi Kubota. Really good offensive player. Put up a 121 WRC plus this year in Philadelphia, but don't know that trade in a guy who's making $30 million for 1 more year for a guy who's going to be 35 in a couple of weeks, making $41 million a year for the next 3 seasons, who's also a right-handed hitter, pretty average defensive player. I don't think that's the trade to make. You can see with the rest of the guys, some guys making pretty big money, some arbitration-eligible players, a lot of relievers, kind of generic relievers. Doesn't look like there's anyone who jumps off the page as far as incredible returns for Rojas. But again, if you can trade Rojas for a guy making the major league minimum like Jorge Rivas, although I don't love his personality, or Dominic Leyland, if you just want to do a salary dump, there is an option to do the salary dump with Twinkle Toes Rojas. And if we did do the salary dump with Mr. Rojas, that would potentially allow us to be players in free agency. Well, one, we could just bring Juan Ramiro back before he hit free agency. Could also let us on the margin maybe be a player for a Maples if the price comes down a little bit, or if a Clark or a Bond or a Toby Golston, who we also looked at trading for before the trade deadline last year, lingers on the market. If a Markell lingers on the market, moving on from Rojas would give us a little bit of optionality to perhaps be a bit more active in free agency this year. So if you've got thoughts on what we should do, to me it's really a question of if we trade away Rojas and that $30 million, it's a salary dump. We're not getting back much of anything useful in return. But if we do that, we then have the opportunity to bring Romero back. Can probably sign him for maybe $17 million a year for 5 years. So we're kind of extending the commitment further since we'd be in the last year with Rojas, but we're getting a guy with Romero who's younger, good in the clubhouse, an Iron Man who plays every day. And if we did move on from Mr. Rojas, that could let us move Seifu to play first base every day, which would let us potentially keep both Contreras and Whitehead on the roster next year. And then we'd have a little more flexibility with the likes of Porter, Canales, and possibly a Coma Duran or Romero to mix and match with those players among the two corner outfield spots and the DH role if we opened that up from Seifu next year. So I think there's arguments to trade away Rojas, but I also think there's arguments to just keep him next year at $30 million to avoid signing Romero for likely 4 or 5 years. I think there's also an argument to be made that you trade away Rojas and you don't sign Romero, and you really open up a lot more financial flexibility for the long term. So thoughts on the Rojas versus Romero decision would be helpful. In the meantime, though, I haven't forgot what I was talking about. I am going to make an offer to try to bring Coma Duran back. I think he's the best left-handed hitter that's potentially available. He's proven he can be very productive with us in Buffalo. He's only 31 years old, so he's not looking for an insane amount of years. Just a matter of whether we can agree to something that's a little more palatable from our end in terms of the optionality, the dollars, and maybe the years. And Coma Duran was looking for 5 years, $20 million a season with a team option for the 5th year. We're going to offer, and he also wanted a no trade clause and a guaranteed starting lineup role. We're going to offer him 4 years at $18.5 million a year, a team option for the 4th year, and we're not going to include the no trade clause. Although he will, in about a year and a half, kind of have 10-5 rights with us anyways. So he'll get an implicit no trade clause anyways. So I guess if we have to include the no trade clause, it's not the end of the world. He opted out of a $17 million number for this upcoming season, so the fact that that's all we're offering him, I don't know if that's going to be a sticking point or not. As I noted, the average is higher than the 17 he was going to make, lower than the 20 he was going to look for. We're taking out a year. We're giving ourselves the option. We'll see what Luis thinks. Says the deal is doable if we'll include a no trade clause. In a perfect world, I'd prefer not to, but it does look like he's willing to do the 4 years, although he's wanting a little more money in the player option. But I think if we include the no trade clause, we can probably get terms pretty similar to those we had initially proposed as far as the years and the money. So we're going to offer him the exact same deal, $18.5 million over 4 years average with the team option for the final season. We are going to include the no trade clause, as I noted. A year and a half into this deal, he's going to effectively have a no trade clause anyways with his 10-5 rights that he'll have. So I don't feel horrible about doing it, since unless we were to trade him in the next year and a half, which is pretty unlikely, he's going to have the no trade anyways. The question is whether he'll go for this lower money than he was asking for. And he is going to be more insistent on a little more money, and he still really wants that player option. So going to have to try to get something done, but it may be a little trickier than we would have hoped. And we're keeping it at 4 years. We're now giving him the player option for the 4th season. We're just kind of putting it in a situation where the money for the next 3 years is going to be a little less, and then he'll have a $20 million option in the 4th year. At $18.125 million a year for the 4 years, we're $1.275 million a year below what he's asking for. But we're giving him the no trade clause he wanted, and we're giving him the player option in the final season that he wanted. I think there's a chance he'll go for this, and he's willing to consider it. So we've got an offer, 4 years, $72.5 million out to Mr. Coma Duran. Felt like he was potentially the best left-handed hitter available. So although some of you may disagree with our approach with him, it's too late for you to tell me I'm making a mistake, since I've already potentially made the mistake. But would certainly like your thoughts on the Rojas situation, the Romero situation, even the pitching situations with Joe Scott and David Espinoza. Got a lot of interesting decisions to make this upcoming offseason, as I had mentioned, and any thoughts and guidance from those of you who have been following us for 8+ months at this point, or even if you're only joining us for the first time ever, are appreciated. In our next episode, we'll take a look at our farm system, take a look at how some of our former players have fared around the majors over the past year, and really formulate the approach that we're going to use when we start simming forward and the off-season begins. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.